She was one of the most powerful and controversial women in history, a figure cloaked in silk and mystery, ruling from behind a curtain yet controlling the fate of a vast empire. Her name sparked fear, admiration, and intrigue, both within the Forbidden City and beyond China's borders. For decades, the Dowager Empress defied tradition, outwitted political rivals, and shaped a dynasty on the brink of collapse. But behind the grandeur and power lay a story far more complex, one of resilience, sacrifice, ambition, and legacy. Welcome to Words of Time, where history speaks and the past comes alive. In this video we will journey beyond the palace walls to uncover the lasting legacy of the Dowager Empress, examining not only her reign, but how her influence echoes through time. We'll explore the decisions that defined her, the myths that surrounded her, and the history that remembers her. Get ready to see her story in a new light. Born into a world of profound tradition and shifting political landscapes, the Dowager Empress Cixi of the Qing dynasty occupies one of the most paradoxical roles in the grand theater of Chinese imperial history. Her name, Empress Dowager Cixi, evokes images of elegance, authority, and mystery. Emerging from the lower rungs of Manchu aristocracy, she ascended through the imperial harem to a seat of absolute influence, reigning as the de facto ruler of China for nearly half a century during one of its most turbulent eras. Her story is one of survival, maneuvering, and commanding power from behind the silk curtains of the Forbidden City. Cixi's rise began in 1851 when she entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. She was just 16, one among many women selected to serve the emperor. Yet her intelligence, ambition, and political acumen set her apart. In 1856 she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, Zichuan, instantly raising her status in the imperial hierarchy. This pivotal moment marked the beginning of a lifelong climb toward supreme power. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, Cixi's 6-year-old son ascended the throne as the Tongji Emperor, and Cixi, now Empress Dowager, entered the inner sanctum of Chinese power, first as regent and eventually as its dominant force. Cixi's era of influence unfolded during a time of immense internal strife and external pressure. The Qing dynasty was struggling under the weight of rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion, the largest civil war in history, as well as encroaching Western imperialism. It was an age where China's sovereignty was increasingly threatened by unequal treaties, military defeats, and humiliations at the hands of foreign powers. Amid this backdrop, Cixi navigated court politics with an unmatched instinct for survival. She formed strategic alliances, manipulated court factions, and orchestrated political purges, all while maintaining the delicate dance of deference and discretion expected of a woman in her position. Her regency began with a bold and calculated coup. Upon her husband's death, 8 regents had been appointed to govern on behalf of her young son. But Cixi, along with the senior Empress Dowager Xian and the powerful Prince Gong, outmaneuvered them in what became known as the Xinyo coup. It was a bloodless but decisive shift in the balance of power. By placing the royal seals under her control and forging critical alliances, Cixi emerged as the true authority behind the throne, even as male figures were officially credited with power. It was the beginning of her long-standing strategy, ruling from the shadows, never sitting on the throne herself but always pulling the strings from behind the golden screen. Throughout her time in power, Cixi cultivated a commanding image, majestic and untouchable. She was frequently portrayed in lavish portraits, adorned in exquisitely embroidered dragon robes, her surroundings heavy with symbolic displays of wealth, longevity, and imperial authority. She resided in the opulent summer palace and commissioned numerous architectural projects, blending traditional Chinese aesthetics with new elements that spoke of a ruling elite, both ancient and adaptive. Even as she aged, portraits emphasized her serenity, poise, and seemingly eternal control. Yet behind this grandeur lay a court gripped by factionalism, secrets, and tightly woven intrigue. Cixi wielded her influence with careful calculation. She embraced Confucian values when they suited her aims, projecting herself as the dutiful mother of the nation. Yet she also subverted gender norms by seizing a role traditionally reserved for men. She presided over court affairs, issued edicts, and was consulted on military and diplomatic matters. Her grasp of statecraft was not theoretical, it was lived and enforced. Ministers knew that without her approval, no major policy could be enacted. Even as successive emperors nominally ruled, first her son the Tongji Emperor and later her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, it was Cixi who dictated the realm's direction. Her reign was not without contradiction. On one hand, she promoted reforms in the self-strengthening movement, aimed at modernizing China's military and industrial capacities in response to Western advances. On the other hand, she was deeply conservative, often resisting radical change that threatened imperial traditions. The Hundred Days Reform of 1898, led by the young Guangxu emperor, became a flashpoint. Cixi initially withdrew from public life to allow her nephew to implement sweeping changes, but when the reforms threatened to diminish her authority, she launched a dramatic counter-coup. The emperor was placed under house arrest, and the reformist movement was crushed. It was a clear message: power remained where it always had with her. Yet even in resistance, Cixi displayed a keen understanding of perception and control. She managed the imperial image with artistry, ensuring the court remained a spectacle of refinement and unity even as it fractured beneath the surface. Western visitors to the Qing court were often dazzled by its ceremonial grandeur. The Empress Dowager herself was described with fascination, sometimes admiration, and often confusion by foreign envoys. She held daily audiences behind a silk screen, a potent symbol of indirect yet absolute rule, and her judgments were final. The Empress Dowager also made calculated displays of benevolence and piety. She sponsored temples, presided over religious ceremonies, and observed court rituals with rigorous attention to detail. These public acts reinforced her legitimacy in a society deeply rooted in Confucian values. In private, she maintained strict control over her household and courtiers, cultivating loyalty through gifts, titles, and appointments, while punishing disloyalty with quiet but effective severity. Despite the external image of unassailable control, her rule faced constant threats. The Qing military, once dominant, was weakened by corruption and outdated practices. Foreign invasions and uprisings destabilized the empire. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, a nationalist uprising against foreign influence, saw Cixi initially support the anti-Western cause before retreating in the face of a massive foreign intervention. Her flight from Beijing during the Eight-Nation Alliance's invasion was a rare moment of visible vulnerability. Yet she returned, and with typical resilience, she reshaped her image as a reformer in her final years. In the twilight of her life, Cixi embarked on a series of institutional reforms. Spurred by the realization that the old order was unsustainable, she approved measures for modern education, a reformed legal system, and plans for a constitutional monarchy. Whether these were genuine attempts at modernization or efforts to placate reformist forces and foreign powers remains debated. What is certain is that she remained the central figure in every major decision until her death in 1908. Cixi's death marked the end of an era. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by internal rot and external aggression, would collapse just a few years later in 1912. But during her life, she had stood as a symbol of imperial tenacity and the complexities of absolute power. To the public and to posterity, she embodied the paradoxes of a dying empire, splendid in its rituals, ruthless in its politics, resistant to change yet desperately needing it. Her legacy is as opulent and contradictory as the empire she governed. For decades, historians portrayed her as a despot whose conservatism hastened China's decline. Others have re-evaluated her as a shrewd leader who maintained a crumbling empire in an age of relentless upheaval. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. She was not a revolutionary, but she was not simply a reactionary tyrant either. She was a survivor, an operator of immense intelligence, capable of both cruelty and vision. Behind her carefully cultivated title of Empress Dowager stood a woman who had mastered the art of power in a male-dominated world, who cloaked her ambitions in the language of tradition and loyalty while redefining the very structure of court politics. She was the ultimate political realist in an age of dreams and delusions. Her story, filled with silks, secrets, and statecraft, remains one of the most compelling in global history, a reminder that sometimes the person behind the throne is more powerful than the one who sits upon it. As her court continued to dazzle with embroidered banners, golden screens, and solemn rituals, the world outside shifted. Foreign railroads were carving up Chinese soil, and revolutionaries were planting the seeds of republicanism. Still, within the walled palaces of the Forbidden City, Cixi reigned with an iron hand wrapped in brocade. She signed decrees with a flick of her brush, sipped rare teas beneath towering silk tapestries, and orchestrated the rhythm of an empire from behind her gauzy veil of seclusion. Thus, the image she projected remained untarnished in the public eye, one of supreme composure, impeccable taste, and undiminished authority. To her subjects and courtiers, she appeared timeless, almost divine, an embodiment of dynastic continuity. Every motion, every edict, every appearance was designed to reinforce her singular position as the guardian of tradition and order. It was a carefully managed performance, one that masked the immense pressures and dangers surrounding her throne. Though she never wore the imperial crown, her word carried more weight than any emperor of her time. Hers was a rule forged not through legitimacy alone but through relentless skill, manipulation, and political artistry. She understood the importance of symbolism, how architecture, dress, ritual, and silence could speak louder than armies or proclamations. She wielded these tools masterfully, creating a persona that has endured in the global imagination long after the dynasty she upheld crumbled into history. The Empress Dowager Cixi remains a figure cloaked not only in silk but in legend. Her life invites admiration, criticism, and endless fascination. She reigned behind a curtain but stood at the center of an empire's final drama, illuminated by the flickering light of a dying dynasty. Her story is not just one of privilege and power, it is a testament to the resilience and complexity of leadership in a world where tradition and transformation collided with irreversible force. The life of Empress Dowager Cixi, though steeped in grandeur and power, was shadowed by personal tragedies and ceaseless political turmoil. Behind the gilded latticework of the Forbidden City, beyond the dragon-embroidered robes and the rituals of state, lay a woman deeply scarred by loss and relentlessly tested by intrigue. Her public persona radiated confidence and strength, but within the chambers of her private world, sorrow and betrayal left lasting imprints on her soul. The story of her rule is not just the tale of an iron-willed empress manipulating an empire from behind the silk screen, it is also a chronicle of maternal grief, emotional isolation, and a lifetime spent entangled in the merciless web of court politics. Cixi's early years in the imperial palace were filled with uncertainty and adjustment. As a concubine of the Xianfeng emperor, she entered a hierarchical world where women were routinely sidelined and where survival depended on favor and cunning. Giving birth to Zai Chun in 1856, the emperor's only surviving son, should have brought unassailable security. Instead, it placed her in the vortex of a brutal struggle. Court life revolved around the delicate balance of favor, jealousy, and power. As the mother of the heir, she became both a target and a key player. Her every move was scrutinized, her relationships monitored, and her child's future weaponized by factions within the palace. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, Cixi's son ascended the throne as the Tongji emperor at just 5 years old. This shift elevated her position dramatically, but with that elevation came an avalanche of political danger. She allied with the senior Empress Dowager Qian and orchestrated a coup against the 8 regents who had been appointed to govern. The victory secured her status as regent, yet it marked the beginning of a life lived on guard, where every alliance was tentative and every victory precarious. The palace became both her stronghold and her prison, a place of absolute authority but also of profound emotional sacrifice. One of the most searing tragedies of her life came with the loss of her son. As the Tongji emperor came of age, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became known for his recklessness, indulgence, and refusal to adhere to the ceremonial responsibilities of an emperor. Despite Cixi's efforts to guide and control him, he proved ungovernable. His reign was short and troubled. In 1875, at just 18 years old, he died under mysterious circumstances, officially from smallpox, though rumors of syphilis or even foul play swirled in hushed tones. The grief Cixi experienced was immense, yet it was tempered by political urgency. Her son's death left a gaping hole in the line of succession, and as Empress Dowager, she could not afford the luxury of mourning for long. Her sorrow was absorbed by the machinery of governance. She had to act swiftly, ensuring the dynasty's continuity while preserving her power. She chose her nephew, Zhaitian, to become the Guangxu emperor, bypassing other eligible candidates and ensuring that he was adopted posthumously as the son of her deceased son, an act that maintained dynastic legitimacy while keeping control in her grasp. Yet this decision, though politically shrewd, deepened her personal isolation. Zhaitian was a distant child, and their relationship was far more strained than the one she had shared with her own son. Raising him was less an act of affection than one of necessity, and their eventual clash in adulthood would tear through both their lives. The tension between Cixi and the Guangxu emperor reached a climax in 1898 with the 100 Days Reform. Influenced by reformist thinkers and motivated by a sincere desire to modernize China, the young emperor attempted to implement sweeping changes to the administrative, military, and educational systems. Cixi, initially silent, watched as he proposed edicts that would strip her loyalists of power and redefine the Qing court structure. The reforms threatened her authority and undermined the cautious approach she had maintained for decades. In a swift and ruthless counteraction, she launched a coup, placed the emperor under house arrest in the Summer Palace, and executed or exiled many of the reformists. The reform movement was extinguished almost overnight. This episode revealed more than just a political rift. It exposed the emotional toll that years of control and manipulation had taken. The Guangxu Emperor's rebellion was not merely a policy disagreement, it was a personal betrayal by the very boy she had elevated and nurtured into power. The decision to suppress him, though necessary to preserve her dominance, came at a steep emotional price. From that moment forward, their relationship disintegrated into quiet hostility, marked by mutual distrust and a shared understanding that the imperial court was not large enough for both of them to rule freely. Cixi's court, filled with lavish banquets, diplomatic ceremonies and elaborate pageantry, masked a persistent atmosphere of paranoia and surveillance. She trusted few, and rightly so. Betrayal was a constant threat. Eunuchs whispered secrets, ministers courted rival patrons, and foreign advisors reported back to embassies that plotted their own interventions. At every step of her rule, Cixi had to fend off plots, neutralize threats, and play the long game of imperial politics. This relentless vigilance left little room for genuine companionship or emotional release. Even in moments of celebration, she remained guarded. Loneliness, an inevitable companion to power, shadowed her throughout her reign. In the backdrop of her personal grief and political vigilance stood the ever-encroaching threat of foreign powers. China in the late 19th century was besieged by colonial ambitions. The Opium Wars had left the empire scarred, its sovereignty diminished. Foreign concessions carved into Chinese territory, and missionaries, soldiers and merchants flooded into port cities. Cixi had to navigate this external pressure with extreme caution. She resented foreign intrusion, yet she understood the empire's military and economic vulnerabilities. Her strategy was one of delay and containment rather than open resistance. But this balancing act faltered with the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The uprising, fueled by anti-foreign and anti-Christian sentiment, initially seemed a spontaneous expression of Chinese nationalism. Secret societies, mysticism, and violent rhetoric coalesced into a movement that gained ground quickly. At first skeptical, Cixi eventually threw her support behind the Boxers, declaring war against the foreign powers. It was a desperate gamble, an emotional outburst against decades of humiliation. The result was catastrophic. A coalition of 8 foreign nations invaded Beijing, forcing Cixi to flee the capital disguised in humble clothing, a spectacle of shame for an empress accustomed to grandeur. Her time in exile during the Boxer War was one of humiliation and forced reflection. The Forbidden City had always been her fortress, the symbol of her power and permanence. To be driven from it by foreign troops, to witness the desecration of her court, and to return under foreign supervision was an unbearable blow to her pride and vision of imperial sovereignty. Yet she endured. She negotiated the Boxer Protocol, accepted the painful terms, and returned to the palace with the dignity she could salvage. But the emotional wound was deep and lasting. It was not just the empire that had been violated, it was her own illusion of control. In the years following the Boxer disaster, Cixi undertook a series of reforms, signaling a shift in her political approach. Whether motivated by genuine remorse, strategic necessity, or a final attempt to salvage Qing legitimacy, she endorsed changes to the military, legal codes, and education. A blueprint for constitutional monarchy was drafted. Civil service exams were modernized. These moves, though too late to reverse the dynasty's decline, showed a new side of Cixi, a ruler attempting to reconcile her iron-fisted past with the growing reality of national reform. Yet her personal world continued to erode. The Guangxu Emperor, long a prisoner in his own court, grew frail and bitter. In a final act of tragedy, he died in 1908, just a day before Cixi herself. Rumors persist that she ordered his poisoning to ensure that he would not reverse her policies after her death. Whether true or not, the timing of their deaths remains one of the most haunting footnotes of her life. The boy she had raised, ruled over, and silenced finally departed this world alongside the empress who had shaped his destiny. Their story, soaked in political manipulation, was also a tragedy of thwarted human connection. As she lay dying, surrounded by eunuchs and loyal officials, Cixi made one last move to secure her legacy. She named Puyi, a 3-year-old boy, as the next emperor. It was a decision designed to keep the dynasty alive, to maintain a semblance of continuity. Yet it also underscored the futility of her life's work. Puyi would become the last emperor of China. Just 4 years later, the Qing dynasty collapsed, swept away by revolution. The world Cixi had fought so hard to preserve crumbled, its structures no match for the modern tide. Still, her presence lingered in the court's silence, in the lacquered halls of the summer palace, and in the memories of those who had lived through her reign. Her life was marked by opulence and command, but also by devastating loss and relentless struggle. She ruled in a system that demanded absolute control while offering little emotional reprieve. Her every decision was both political and personal, shaped by grief, ambition, fear, and duty. Her tragedies were not just those of a mother or a woman, but of a sovereign forced to harden herself against the very world she sought to command. Empress Dowager Cixi remains one of history's most complex figures. Her story is not easily categorized as either villainous or heroic. She was capable of immense cruelty and profound resilience, often in the same breath. Her sorrow was not paraded in public, but it echoed through her actions, her silences, and her resistance to trust. The personal losses she endured, her son, her family, her illusions of safety shaped her reign as much as any treaty or decree. Beneath the silks and the shadows, behind the rituals and the throne, lived a woman caught between tradition and transformation, haunted by betrayals and strengthened by suffering. Her legacy, forged in blood, silk, and sorrow, is not just that of an empress but of a survivor in the labyrinth of dynastic decline. In the grand expanse of Chinese history, few women have wielded the kind of sustained political power and influence that Empress Dowager Cixi commanded. Rising from the rank of a lowly concubine to the de facto ruler of the Qing Empire for nearly 5 decades, her political journey was a blend of shrewd calculation, deft maneuvering, and a relentless instinct for survival. Her tenure coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in Chinese history, a time of internal decay, foreign encroachment, and calls for reform that would shake the very foundations of the dynastic order. And through it all, Cixi navigated the labyrinthine corridors of court politics with an astuteness that both awed and terrified those around her. Cixi's political acumen became apparent early in her life at court. As one among many consorts to the Xianfeng emperor, she initially held little power or visibility. But her intelligence, understanding of court etiquette, and ability to read the shifting undercurrents of palace life quickly set her apart. The turning point came in 1856 when she gave birth to Zai Chun, the emperor's only surviving son. This changed her position drastically. With the birth of an heir, her status rose within the inner court, and she began to cultivate relationships with key figures, both eunuchs and court ladies, who would become instrumental in her rise. Her ability to forge strategic alliances was not limited to personal loyalties. She was equally adept at navigating the factionalism that defined the late Qing court. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, the Qing court was in disarray. Foreign powers had humiliated China in the Second Opium War, the economy was strained, and rebellion simmered across the empire. The emperor had appointed 8 regents to guide his young son, now the Tongji emperor, but these men were traditionalists with little appetite for reform and even less interest in sharing power. Cixi, who had been named co-regent alongside Empress Dowager Qian, saw an opportunity. In what would become known as the Sinuan coup, she collaborated with Prince Gong, a reform-minded member of the imperial clan, and successfully ousted the 8 regents. This bold and calculated move not only eliminated her rivals but also established her as a key power broker in the imperial court. It was an early demonstration of her ability to capitalize on both timing and alliances to consolidate authority. Throughout her regency, Cixi maintained her power by carefully balancing court factions. She understood the importance of appearing to share authority, often presenting herself as co-ruler with Empress Dowager Qian and later with the young emperors she placed on the throne. This illusion of shared governance allowed her to deflect criticism while ensuring that real power remained in her hands. She managed senior officials with a mixture of reward, punishment, and psychological insight. Loyal ministers were elevated, dissenters were marginalized or exiled. She made use of secret memorials and private audiences to stay informed, giving her an edge in the court's internal chessboard. Her understanding of protocol and the symbolism of imperial rule enabled her to command respect even when formal authority was vested in others. One of her most significant political strategies was her use of regency to maintain control long after the emperors she installed had reached maturity. When her son, the Tongji emperor, died young and without an heir, she broke with convention and chose her nephew, Zai Tian, to ascend the throne as the Guangxu emperor. Technically, this made the boy the posthumous son of the Tongji emperor, preserving dynastic legitimacy while ensuring that the new ruler was still under her influence. As Guangxu grew older, Cixi delayed his full assumption of power and continued to exert control from behind the scenes. This method of indirect rule became a hallmark of her political style, allowing others the appearance of authority while she managed the levers of power. Cixi's tenure as ruler saw several critical decisions that had long-lasting impacts on Chinese history. One of her earliest accomplishments after the Sinuan coup was to support Prince Gong in establishing the Zhongli Yamen, a government office for managing foreign affairs. This marked the beginning of China's attempt to engage diplomatically with Western powers in a structured way. Under her oversight, the self-strengthening movement was initiated, aiming to modernize China's military and industrial capabilities by borrowing Western technologies and practices. Though the movement ultimately fell short of transforming the Qing Empire into a modern state, it represented a departure from the staunch isolationism of earlier decades. Another major area where Cixi left her mark was in infrastructure and industrial development. During her regency, China saw the introduction of telegraph lines, the first modern railways, steamships, and factories. These developments were part of her broader strategy to revitalize the empire's capabilities in the face of foreign aggression and internal dissent. While she was often cautious, some might argue obstructionist about adopting radical reforms, she recognized the necessity of selective modernization to preserve the Qing regime. Her support for the Kaiping coal mines and the China Merchant Steam Navigation Company illustrates her willingness to allow certain economic innovations that could strengthen the state's foundations. Yet her caution also revealed itself in her handling of the 100 Days Reform of 1898. When the Guangxu Emperor, influenced by reformist scholars like Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, launched a series of bold initiatives to overhaul the imperial system, Cixi was initially silent. But as the scope of the reforms expanded, threatening to dismantle the bureaucracy she had so carefully cultivated, she acted decisively. Declaring the emperor unfit to rule, she staged a palace coup, placed him under house arrest, and executed several reformist leaders. This move, while controversial, was consistent with her lifelong strategy: support reform only when it served to preserve imperial authority, never when it threatened it. Her most catastrophic political decision came with the Boxer Rebellion. Initially wary of the Boxers, whose anti-foreign and anti-Christian sentiments aligned with her own but whose methods were chaotic, Cixi vacillated. When foreign troops entered Beijing and diplomatic tensions exploded, she threw her support behind the Boxers and declared war on the Eight-Nation Alliance. This miscalculation led to a devastating military defeat, the occupation of Beijing, and the imposition of the Boxer Protocol, a humiliating treaty that further eroded Chinese sovereignty. While some historians view her decision as a desperate attempt to defend national pride, others see it as the moment her conservatism fatally compromised the dynasty's future. Regardless, the fallout from the Boxer Rebellion severely damaged her reputation and limited her options in the twilight of her rule. Despite this debacle, Cixi showed remarkable political adaptability in her final years. Recognizing that the Qing dynasty could no longer resist the tide of reform entirely, she initiated a series of changes that hinted at constitutional monarchy. She sanctioned new education systems based on Western models, abolished the centuries-old civil service examination system, restructured the military, and established plans for a national assembly. These late reforms, while not enough to stave off revolution, reflected her capacity for recalibrating her strategy when circumstances demanded. They also suggest that her conservatism was pragmatic rather than dogmatic, a means of protecting imperial power rather than opposing change outright. Cixi's impact on the Qing dynasty in China as a whole is complex and often contentious. Supporters argue that she preserved the dynasty during a period of extraordinary upheaval, maintaining relative stability in the face of internal rebellions, external invasions, and seismic cultural shifts. Without her guidance, the Qing Empire might have collapsed decades earlier. Her political decisions allowed China to survive, however precariously, into the 20th century, giving it time to absorb and eventually act upon the lessons of modernization. Her critics, on the other hand, accuse her of perpetuating a reactionary regime, stifling reform, and placing her own power above the interests of the nation. They cite her suppression of the 100 Days Reform and her role in the Boxer Rebellion as evidence of a ruler out of step with the needs of her time. But reducing her legacy to a binary of savior or villain oversimplifies the nuanced and often contradictory nature of her reign. Cixi operated within a patriarchal and deeply conservative system, one that offered women no formal pathway to power. That she not only navigated but dominated this system for nearly 5 decades is a testament to her political brilliance. She reshaped the role of women in Chinese politics, even if she never outwardly challenged the gender norms of her time. Her life and reign forced the male-dominated court to reckon with a female authority figure whose command was absolute and whose judgment was feared. Her cultural influence was also significant. She supported the arts, theater, and traditional Chinese crafts. She commissioned architectural marvels such as the marble boat at the Summer Palace and patronized court painters and artisans whose works remain celebrated today. While these projects are sometimes criticized as extravagant, they also served to project imperial dignity during a time of diminishing power. They were part of her larger strategy of maintaining the image of strength and continuity, even as the dynasty crumbled under the weight of modern pressures. The nation Cixi left behind in 1908 was deeply divided and on the brink of transformation. Within 3 years of her death, the Qing dynasty fell, and the Republic of China was born. It is tempting to view her life as the final chapter in the story of imperial China, the last formidable figure before the old order gave way to modernity. But her legacy extends beyond that symbolic threshold. She embodied the contradictions of a society caught between past and future, an empire that could neither fully modernize nor completely preserve its traditions. Her story remains one of the most dramatic in the annals of Chinese history. She ruled from behind a screen, never officially ascending the throne, yet her influence was as powerful as that of any emperor. She guided an empire through revolutions, invasions, and reformations, always adapting, always surviving. Her political genius was matched by a deep understanding of image, symbolism, and perception. She knew how to project control even when circumstances slipped beyond it, and she understood that in politics as in theater, the appearance of power can be as important as power itself. Cixi's ability to shape history lay not only in her decisions but in her enduring example of how power can be wielded from the margins. In an age that denied women any formal authority, she became one of the most influential figures of her time. Her life challenges assumptions about gender, leadership, and legacy, forcing historians and readers alike to reconsider what it means to rule and at what cost. She was a master of strategy, a guardian of tradition, and however flawed, a woman who changed the course of a nation. The Dowager Empress, often remembered simply as Empress Dowager Cixi, occupies a singular place in the annals of Chinese history. Her life and legacy transcend the typical boundaries imposed by her role as a ruler cloaked in ceremonial power. While she never formally sat on the imperial throne, she was for nearly 5 decades the ultimate authority behind it, shaping the destiny of the Qing dynasty and, by extension, the course of modern China. The legacy she left behind is layered, multifaceted, and often debated. Historians and observers have long grappled with how to define her: tyrant or visionary, reactionary or reformer, savior of the Qing or symbol of its decline. Yet, the truth is far more complex, and to understand her enduring influence is to recognize a woman who defied expectations, outmaneuvered adversaries, and left an indelible mark on the nation's historical trajectory. Cixi's influence on future generations begins with her extraordinary path to power. Born in 1835 into a relatively obscure Manchu family, she entered the imperial harem as a low-ranking concubine. Her ascent from these humble beginnings to become the de facto ruler of the empire is, in itself, an emblem of determination, intelligence, and political skill. For generations of women in China and indeed, around the world, her story has served as a remarkable, if complex, symbol of female agency within rigid patriarchal structures. Although she did not overtly challenge the social and political norms that subordinated women, her rise implicitly subverted them. Her very presence in the highest echelons of power inspired curiosity, awe, and, in some circles, emulation. In an age when women were largely confined to domestic roles, she exercised authority over an empire of hundreds of millions. Her influence was not confined to symbolic representation. Through the machinery of government, Cixi made decisions that would resonate long after her death. One of the most visible aspects of her legacy lies in her approach to modernization. Though often accused of resisting reform, especially in her early years, a more nuanced view suggests she was deeply pragmatic. She supported modernization when it served to bolster the imperial system and maintain social order. She allowed the construction of telegraph lines and railways, backed industrial projects, and sanctioned the development of modern education. Even after the disaster of the Boxer Rebellion, when her decision to support the anti-foreign uprising brought international condemnation, she pivoted, endorsing reforms with an urgency that suggested genuine commitment to change. The reforms enacted during her final years, known collectively as the New Policies, marked a turning point in Chinese governance. These included overhauls in the military, judicial, and educational systems, the establishment of provincial assemblies, and the laying of groundwork for a constitutional monarchy. While many of these reforms were incomplete or inconsistently implemented, they signaled a shift from the insular conservatism that had previously defined Qing policy. More importantly, they sowed the seeds of political consciousness that would later blossom in the Republican and revolutionary movements of the 20th century. In this way, Cixi's late reforms helped prepare China, however imperfectly, for the modern age. Her decisions also had a lasting impact on how the Chinese state related to the outside world. Although she initially viewed foreign powers with suspicion and fear, her administration increasingly engaged in diplomatic relations and treaty negotiations. Her endorsement of the Zhongli Yamen, China's first foreign affairs office, marked the institutionalization of diplomacy in the Qing government. By recognizing the need to engage with foreign powers on more equal footing, she nudged China away from the isolated worldview that had long characterized its imperial ethos. This shift laid the groundwork for the international posture of the modern Chinese state. While her era was marked by humiliation at the hands of stronger foreign nations, her cautious engagement allowed China to survive a period in which complete collapse was a real possibility. Another enduring aspect of her legacy lies in cultural memory and representation. In traditional historiography, particularly during the early Republican era, Cixi was vilified as a manipulative, despotic figure responsible for the fall of the Qing dynasty. Popular narratives depicted her as a symbol of imperial decadence, focusing on stories of opulent spending, brutal court politics, and her alleged interference in state affairs. For many years, this image dominated both Chinese and Western understandings of her life and reign. However, more recent scholarship has worked to challenge and complicate this portrayal, painting a picture of a more pragmatic and capable ruler constrained by her time and context. This reevaluation has been particularly important in reshaping her place in modern Chinese consciousness. Rather than viewing her as solely responsible for the dynasty's decline, some historians now emphasize the structural challenges she faced: foreign aggression, internal rebellion, a corrupt bureaucracy, and centuries of rigid tradition. In this view, she becomes less a villain and more a symbol of resilience in the face of impossible odds. This shift in interpretation reflects a broader reassessment of women's roles in history and a growing willingness to acknowledge the limitations and possibilities inherent in their choices. Cixi's legacy also lives on in physical form in the monuments, palaces, and artistic works she commissioned or preserved. The Summer Palace in Beijing, which she helped reconstruct after its destruction by Western forces, stands as a testament to her appreciation for traditional Chinese aesthetics and imperial grandeur. Though criticized for allegedly diverting naval funds to restore the palace, an accusation modern scholar has questioned, the site remains one of China's most iconic historical landmarks. The architecture and design reflect not only her personal tastes but also her desire to project imperial strength and cultural continuity in an age of disruption. Her patronage of the arts extended to other realms as well. She supported traditional opera, encouraged craftsmanship, and maintained the rituals and ceremonies that defined Qing court culture. In doing so, she helped preserve elements of Chinese heritage that might otherwise have been lost during a period of rapid change. At the same time, her ability to use these cultural tools as instruments of political legitimacy reveals her understanding of the soft power embedded in art, ritual, and spectacle. Perhaps one of the most profound dimensions of her legacy is the question she leaves behind: what does it mean to rule without ruling? Cixi never declared herself emperor, never issued edicts in her own name, and always operated behind the curtain of imperial protocol. Yet her authority was absolute. Her style of governance behind the scenes, indirect yet ironclad, challenges traditional conceptions of leadership. She demonstrated that power could be wielded through influence, persuasion, and manipulation as effectively as through formal titles. This model has resonated with later generations of political thinkers and historians who seek to understand the subtleties of power dynamics, particularly in societies that emphasize hierarchy and symbolism. Cixi's legacy is not merely historical, it has philosophical and ethical dimensions as well. She forces contemporary audiences to wrestle with the contradictions of leadership. Can a ruler be both conservative and progressive? Can someone act out of self-preservation and still serve the public good? Can authority born of tradition adapt to the demands of modernity? These are the questions her life raises, and they remain relevant today. As such, her story serves as a case study not only in history but in human nature, political strategy, and the moral complexities of governance. In modern China, where debates about reform, tradition, and national identity continue to evolve, Cixi's life offers both cautionary lessons and unexpected inspiration. She represents the difficulty of steering a great civilization through moments of existential crisis. Her decisions, right or wrong, were born of a desire to preserve what she believed was the rightful order of the world. That she sometimes succeeded, even temporarily, is a testament to her formidable intellect and political skill. That she ultimately failed to prevent the fall of the Qing is not a mark of personal incompetence, but an indication of the overwhelming forces arrayed against her. For contemporary viewers and readers seeking to understand her beyond the traditional narrative, it is important to approach her legacy with nuance and critical thought. She cannot be reduced to caricature. She was neither a pure villain nor a flawless heroine. She was a product of her time, navigating an empire besieged from all sides, making choices that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, but always consequential. To appreciate her legacy is to see her in full not just as the Dowager Empress, but as a human being contending with the immense burdens of leadership. The re-evaluation of Cixi's life in modern scholarship also parallels a broader trend toward reclaiming female agency in global history. Across cultures, women in power have often been portrayed through the lens of suspicion or scandal, their achievements minimized or distorted by gendered biases. Cixi's story, when examined without the fog of misogyny and political propaganda, emerges as a powerful reminder that women have always shaped history not just as consorts or caretakers, but as rulers, strategists, and nation-builders. Her life continues to inspire writers, filmmakers, and scholars around the world. From historical biographies to dramatic portrayals, she remains a source of fascination and debate. These cultural representations serve not only to entertain but also to educate, inviting new generations to consider the complexities of her reign and the broader themes it embodies: change and continuity, power and vulnerability, legacy and memory. In this sense, her influence reaches far beyond the years of her regency, echoing in the questions we ask about authority, leadership, and the human cost of empire. To understand the legacy of the Dowager Empress is to step beyond simplistic narratives and into a deeper engagement with history. It is to see her not only as a symbol of a bygone era, but as a woman who, in the face of monumental challenges, left an indelible imprint on the fabric of a nation. Her reign marked the end of imperial China, but her story marks the beginning of a broader conversation about women in power, the burdens of leadership, and the enduring struggle between tradition and progress. She remains, more than a century after her death, a figure who commands attention not for what she merely represented, but for what she achieved and what she made possible. Her legacy, like her life, is too vast to be contained by the confines of conventional history. It continues to unfold, inviting reflection, re-examination, and recognition of a woman who, in every sense of the word, ruled. A layered portrait of a woman who defied the boundaries of her time, navigated the razor-thin edges of power and peril, and shaped the trajectory of a nation in turmoil. Her story is one of contradiction, both revered and reviled, progressive and conservative, commanding yet vulnerable. But beyond the binaries, what emerges is a portrait of complexity, strategy, resilience, and the raw human experience behind the crown. Throughout her life, the Dowager Empress inhabited a world of strict hierarchies, ritualized expectations, and ever-present dangers. Her ascent to power was neither predetermined nor uncontested. She carved out a space for herself in a court dominated by male ministers and emperors, using the limited tools afforded to her as a woman in 19th-century imperial China. Through cunning political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and an acute understanding of courtly dynamics, she managed not only to survive but to rule, first from behind a curtain, then behind the throne, and eventually in full view of a nation on the brink of transformation. She was a woman of her time, yet paradoxically ahead of it. Her rule saw moments of strict conservatism, where tradition was fiercely guarded. Yet it also witnessed unprecedented modernization reforms in education, the military, the postal system, and foreign diplomacy. These shifts did not always stem from ideological vision but often from pragmatic necessity. She knew that to preserve the dynasty, certain changes had to occur, even if they challenged the status quo. This ability to pivot, to compromise without surrender, defined much of her political longevity. But this power came at a personal cost. The Dowager Empress endured profound personal losses of children, allies, and even control. She experienced betrayal from within the palace walls and relentless pressure from foreign powers without. The emotional toll of maintaining authority in a collapsing dynasty cannot be overstated. Behind the layers of silk and ceremony stood a woman who bore the weight of empire on her shoulders while navigating an increasingly fragile world order. Her legacy is not without its shadows. Critics point to her role in suppressing reformers, delaying constitutional change, and failing to effectively counter foreign exploitation. Some hold her partially responsible for the continued weakening of the Qing dynasty, arguing that her desire to maintain personal power came at the expense of national resilience. Yet even these critiques reveal her central role in the historical narrative. One cannot tell the story of modern China's formation without acknowledging her imprint, whether as a cautionary figure, a misunderstood reformer, or a complex leader caught between eras. What remains indisputable is that she was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, if not the world. Her leadership defied the deeply ingrained patriarchy of her culture and time. She stood in a lineage of female power brokers throughout history alongside Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, who wielded influence in male-dominated arenas, often rewriting the rules as they played the game. And like those figures, her memory is shaped as much by myth and interpretation as by documented fact. The story of the Dowager Empress also invites us to think critically about how we remember history. Why are certain figures lionized while others are vilified? Whose stories get told and who tells them? In her case, much of what we know comes from Western diplomats, missionaries, and journalists, many of whom viewed her through the lens of colonial superiority or gendered prejudice. These biases have colored the historical record, portraying her as either a scheming despot or a tragic monarch. It is only through more nuanced, localized, and inclusive research that we begin to see her as a fully formed individual, flawed, yes, but also formidable. In reflecting on her legacy, we are reminded that historical understanding is always evolving. The Dowager Empress's reputation has undergone significant revision over the past century. From being cast as a villain in the early 20th century to a more balanced figure in contemporary historiography, her image continues to be debated and reassessed. This process is not about rewriting history but about enriching it, acknowledging complexity, welcoming contradiction, and embracing uncertainty. True historical literacy comes not from seeking definitive answers but from asking better questions. And so, the life of the Dowager Empress is not just a story about one woman. It is a story about the tensions between tradition and change, about the burden of leadership, and about the intricate interplay of gender, politics, and identity. It is a mirror held up to an empire at its twilight, grappling with internal decay and external pressure. It is also a lens through which we can view our own relationship to history, how we interpret the past, what we choose to remember, and how those choices shape our present. Her story also reminds us of the enduring power of influence that does not rely solely on official titles or public recognition. She never ruled as empress in name, yet for decades she was the de facto sovereign of a vast empire. Her decisions, her court policies, and her patronage of culture and reform reverberated across the land. She ruled from behind the screen, yes, but her reach extended well beyond the palace walls. Today, as we reflect on her legacy, we are also invited to go further. To explore the lives of those who surrounded her, allies, adversaries, advisors, and the many unseen people who made the imperial court function. We are called to consider other hidden histories, other marginalized voices, other powerful but overlooked figures whose contributions deserve recognition. In doing so, we deepen our understanding of not only Chinese history but global history. And in that collective act of discovery, we honor the spirit of inquiry that history demands. The Dowager Empress's legacy lives on not as a singular verdict on her reign, but as a dynamic field of exploration. Her life is a testament to the complexities of power, the burdens of leadership, and the resilience of those who fight to be heard in a world that often seeks to silence them. In rediscovering her story, we also rediscover the broader potential of historical narrative to educate, to inspire, and above all, to humanize. As readers, viewers, and thinkers, we are part of this ongoing conversation. The crown may be gone, the empire dissolved, but the questions endure. What does it mean to lead in times of crisis? How do we balance tradition with innovation? How should history remember those who challenge easy categorization? These questions remain vital not only for scholars but for all of us. In remembering the Dowager Empress, we do not merely recount a life once lived. We participate in a continuing dialogue about history, power, and the human experience. And in doing so, we not only uncover the hidden stories of the past but shape the narratives of the future.